Now, 90 minutes is pretty long, so I decided to go ahead and break this up into a few different sections for the presentation. So Bridges has asked me to talk mostly about the second part of my presentation, which focuses a lot on my own research. I did get to work with Dr. Hauser in the past, and it was a great opportunity to actually work on a paper based off his own work. And there's so many questions that we still have to think about as far as deaf mentorship is concerned, which is my personal area of interest. Now, the last section here, I really do like to try and end my presentations with some good takeaways for you all, so we'll look at that in a bit. So, my life story. Every day, at the age of 3, this is what I wore. No, I'm just kidding. This was for Halloween. But my everyday clothes were more the 70s feel. Not quite that bad, but I think this is one of the last pictures of me while I still had some residual hearing. I, was 3, but I was still using a pacifier, so don't judge me too much, but this is where I was at that time as a young toddler. Now, you might assume that I had spinal meningitis and that caused my deafness, but the thing is, who's a doctor here? I think we have 2 right now, right? Scott and Tiffany are the MDs in the room. Now, I did not become deaf from spinal meningitis, actually. It was while I was growing up. So let me back up a second. Now, there was aspirin that was allowed to be given to children at the time while I was a kid. It stopped being permitted a little bit later on, but when I was young, all of my siblings and I contracted the flu. Now, my parents had gone to, this happened a few days after Thanksgiving, and everyone had gotten hit with the flu, and the babysitter decided to give us Pepto-Bismol. I'm sure you've all been, you've taken Pepto-Bismol, but what often happens is that there is bismuth within it. So when I was given the Pepto-Bismol for the flu, I started to actually get worse. I started to become a little hazy and delusional. My mom was really confused about what was going on. So she brought me to the hospital, and I saw the primary care physician, and they just sent me home. She didn't quite buy it, so we went to the ER because she knew that something was up after I had taken that. And when I was tested, I had found out that I had a liver issue, an inflammation problem. And yep, you called it. I'm not sure who the author is, I haven't met them, but this was a very seminal piece as far as what kinds of medicines could be given to children. Now, my suspicion is that it wouldn't be used, or at least to try and help children with the flu after that point, because those kinds of diseases were temporary, especially with my liver inflammation problem, but I was able to recover. However, most children do end up passing away. The problem is the diagnosis, and oftentimes it's overlooked. So there's usually something there that might be missed. So what often happens is while you have the flu virus, there is a specific type of drug. I don't know if you're familiar with the connexins, but what happens is they interact within the cells, and we're not sure necessarily what, but what often happens is they do bind and then cause some kinds of issues that lead to problems within the fat, and you can't function normally as you were. You end up having those inflammations, and some functions do end up stopping to work. And that's what caused my deafness, in a sense. It had something to do with the antibiotics that I had taken, and my hearing ended up actually worsening a few years back. And when I was tested at Gallaudet to see what had gone down, I'd actually gone down another 30 decibels. Had these fluctuations in my hearing, which was really interesting, but all of this and my deafness and how it impacted me was actually a result of the medicines that I had taken. Now, my parents felt bad about my deafness and gave me this dog. Her name was Shayna. Now, as a deaf person, this is what I looked like growing up, surrounded by other kids. Now, I chose this picture for a special reason. I can really remember that day pretty clearly. I had 2 reasons for being as upset as I look in that picture. Those are all my cousins, and they were having a great time. But as a deaf person, I still wasn't able to really get in the mix of things, and all the boys were kind of playing and doing their own thing. But I also had that bra-looking thing strapped to me all the time. I know many of you that are a little bit older and deaf have been through that too, and so it's kind of isolating. I grew up in Nebraska, in the Omaha area, and I ended up going to a preschool, a hearing school there. I don't know if anyone's been to Omaha or went to school there, but there's an oral program. There's a very strong A.G. Bell philosophy that is taught within that program. I don't really have any pictures from that time because my parents didn't take any, so these are a little bit more recent. But I've gone to present, I think about 10 years ago now, maybe over that by now. Hopefully it's just 10 years ago. This is my former teacher. You know, the teachers were very nice and the environment was fine and all, but a lot of things that were taught had to do with A.G. Bell. And these things were also taught to parents and the kind of patronizing view on deaf people that came from it. I don't remember who exactly taught me, but I do remember learning at some point that people told me that those who signed were actually less than in a way. And I remember that pretty clearly as a kid. And that attitude really stuck with me for a while. It was well ingrained in me as a kid, and so it took a while to get out of it. I was hearing as a child, so it was considered successful for me to be able to continue my ability to speak. Now, my parents were separated earlier on. Of course, you know, there are some personal issues that come up with having a deaf child. So I was moved back to Chicago with my mother. My father still lives in Nebraska, born and raised. He stayed there the whole time. But my mother and I and my 3 siblings went out to Chicago, lived with my father for a while, but then we moved back. We decided to attend this school as a family. It was actually a school that specialized in providing services for mentally disabled children. So in 1st and 2nd grade, I went to St. Mary of Providence. I know everyone's kind of giggling at that, but that's where I was. Interesting place. I mean, the building is gorgeous. As a young kid, I mean, it was really nice. It was a nun-run school, and most of the students in the class were actually older than me in age, but their mental age was about mine. And we all had IEPs, which was an interesting situation. And what that means is that for me, my IEP was well advanced because I was functioning in a typical way, but all of my peers were actually mentally disabled. So it kind of set me out in another way at that school as well.
So this is a list of all of my educational experiences, and I have no pictures from Madison. At that time I got married and moved. I went to North Chicago and was in a mainstream program, and then there was another town that had a mainstream program as well. But their school was okay, but we kind of moved back and forth and took turns between schools. But 7th grade on up, we went on the east side to the school there and rode a bus. And there was no one that signed there at that school. I did have an interpreter and was trying to learn to sign at that time, and she used a more sign-supported speech. School was tough. Social life is important. It's important for you to play with your peers and get that interaction as well. So the east side was a better experience for me. In high school, I took some science classes where I really started thinking about science and learning about it more. I took AP Physics, and I realized that there was a very strong physics teacher there and I found out I was able to take physics instead of another science course, and so I took physics and realized that it was something that I was very interested in. And I thought about doing computer engineering or computer technology or physics or something of that sort. was trying to decide exactly what field I wanted to go into. At the point that I graduated and went to college, I didn't sign very much, and I refused to identify myself as deaf. There was a school in California that I was thinking about going to. My parents and I discussed a lot about it. So my parents were afraid that I would be isolated and become depressed if I was out away from home and had no friends. But if I had a support system and was able to do well, then they supported that more. In 1988 was the Gallaudet protest, and I went to a camp at that time and just became involved in the deaf community and just enjoyed it and loved it. I was able to chat. It was a lot of fun. I realized that it was more fun and I could meet cute girls being able to communicate that way. So I did go to Gallaudet University. This is a picture from graduation. My parents, my mother and father here. I got good grades, but I didn't go to class when I first went to Gallaudet. There wasn't really an attendance policy. We could show up, take the test, and be good. We didn't really have to go to class. So I went on with the curriculum at Gallaudet for computer science and went to an internship and decided to change my major. For 3 years, I worked at the same internship at a company in New Jersey, and that experience taught me a whole lot more about science. I felt really out of my element in New Jersey with all the buildings and the large cities, you walk and see everything that looks the same. You're walking down the street. People don't talk to each other. You just go to work and you go home. You work at your computer for 4 hours, you have lunch for an hour, and then you go back to work for 4 hours and you go home. That's it. That was my summer internship, and I realized, is that really what I want as a computer scientist? Do I want to do that? Yes, I want to go into science, but I want it to lead to other things in my life. I knew that I didn't want to work in a box for the rest of my life. I was interested in medicine and thought about becoming a doctor. So I took some classes, and at Gallaudet at that time, the classes weren't real challenging. They were fairly easy. And it was difficult to find challenge on a different level. Now they have a networking program where you can take other classes. If there's not a class allowed at the university, there's an option to take another class. It's a consortium type of thing. And so computers, physics, and there's one other major that has that agreement with the DC consortium. And so we can take it across classes across other universities. There is a challenge with going to universities in DC. You have your dorm life on your campus, but then it's nice to be able to go to other classes as well. I met with the Dean of Admissions at George Washington University and realized they didn't really discriminate bluntly, but basically said that I couldn't do it. So I met with the Dean of Admissions at Johns Hopkins, and really they had the same message for me. They didn't know how a deaf individual could succeed in that environment. People told me not to pursue that. But then one of my friends, also a Gallaudet student, applied for nursing school at Johns Hopkins, and they were rejected. They were sent a long rejection letter explaining why they would not be able to do it and why they can't. It was a very mean letter. So this friend showed it to me, and I decided to go to graduate school for biology. I think I would end up in the same place either way, depending on the decision I made, but I feel I made a good decision to go to the biology program.
So you can see in this picture here, this is a good friend of mine in Maryland. My home was in Wisconsin, as I said before, but I also found myself in Maryland later on for my college and all. Now, when I got to Gallaudet, the first person to Gallaudet with a PhD was actually me from that program. I was the first. Now, the problem for me in that experience is that there was no one to actually look to for any advice. I was kind of stuck as the first person, which means that I had a tougher time trying to make it on my own. You know, I couldn't just go for it at the University of Maryland. I had to try and pave the way as a deaf person, which was, you know, quite a challenge. But now it's a different story. It's great to see a higher number of deaf people with PhDs able to counsel those that are interested in doing it. So for me, when I had made that application to go into a PhD program, they actually called and wanted to meet me for an interview, which was shocking because I would have been the first potential deaf person. So there was an older faculty member that met with me, and I felt normal, which was great. I mean, he was a sweet enough guy, but you know, during grad school, he had supported me, but unfortunately had retired. So by the time I got to the University of Maryland, you can see here, this is about my second year with my siblings, and we're right outside the microbiology building here, still there today. It's my mother and I. We're right in front of our lab. So while I was at the University of Maryland, the program actually changed its title. It was the microbiology program, but as a microbiologist, you know that cell biology actually first comes from biology, the oldest field. But studying at the molecular level and then diverging off into cellular biology and biology is a bit of a difference. So I decided to, they decided rather to move with the times and change the title to what you see up here on the screen, cell biology and molecular genetics, because that's where that general split kind of comes. This is the front of my dissertation. I was talking to someone yesterday, but this is my advisor from the University of Maryland, and they got their PhD from the University of Rochester, actually someone you might know, Virginia Clark. She was my advisor that actually went to the U of R, oddly enough, so small world. So what we did here was try and look at the gene clusters and as they involve different aspects of sequences to try and see what kinds of experiments we could replicate again and again.
There was a 19th century writer that I was studying and reading about, and that gave me some other ideas. And they were talking about the molecular level and proteins and the lipins and everything that continue running, and they can fool the system because the system can't recognize between the positive and negative things that are present there. So that was an ongoing process. And this is a paper from my dissertation. Graduate school, good experience. Well, I arrived at University of Maryland, and their disability student services was not sufficient. They didn't really have money to support that. They were told no, and then I was told no for interpreters. I was told that I had to request interpreters 6 weeks in advance, and they then changed the policy to 8 weeks in advance, which made it even longer and longer that you had to have your plan set before requesting an interpreter. Other departments or at Gallaudet, you either didn't need interpreters or interpreters were provided. And so that was something that I realized was very interesting. When I had to present, I had to prepare way ahead of time. One example for my or my defense, there was no interpreter that showed up. No interpreter showed. They told me to go ahead with the defense, and I felt really stuck, but you know, I had to go with it, and it was a tough process. I went ahead with my presentation, but they asked me questions and I didn't understand what they were asking. It was a small conference room. We started writing back and forth. I felt the heat rising. It was really, I don't know that I can say a good experience. Well, I did make it through graduation. I was proud that there were 6 of us in a class, and out of 6, one got a master's and left the program. So then from the 6, there were 3 dropped out. I was the one left, graduating with my PhD in this program. One of my summer internships was an REU program. It was for deaf students. It was a great experience. And the woman, this is an older picture from my time. Or I'm sorry, this is a more recent picture, not from my time. This is Peter Blumberg. He works at the National Institutes of Health, NCI. And from my previous internship, I knew him, and so he recruited me to work as a post-bac. And then after my PhD, I had no options yet for my postdoc, and so he invited me back for that. And as an advisor, I didn't have good advisors in school. I didn't have good interpreters. This professor, Dr. Bloomberg, signed some, and he provided everything that I needed through my experiences. And the research experience went very quickly, but he was so inspiring. He inspired me to continue working hard and to continue publishing my work as well. He does still work at NIH, and he has a post-bac program. I have sent a few students to him, and he has sent a few students to me as well for internship programs. So I don't get to see him often, but we still do stay in touch.
So this is one of the papers that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today. One great thing about this paper is, one great things about papers is submission date versus acceptance date. We took a protein and called JFP, and what we tried to do was make it fluorescent. So what we did was try and use a green color, and we had a laser that shone through it in order to see the fluorescent colors. And what we did was try and identify different proteins and see if that JFP would make any difference. And then we used the fluorescence to track where the JFP went within the cells. Now, this particular paper had one important protein that had to do with cancer. So when we used the JFP, what we tried to do was tag it to a protein specifically and then cause it to change colors and track that from there to see where it went and then try and apply it to cancer. So we had a few well plates that were growing cells within. And what we were able to do was test different drugs at a more mass scale, which was great. And we wanted to see if any of those fluorescent colors would end up changing based on what we had tagged to the proteins. And it went up pretty well. And here's another paper you can look at. So while we were doing that tracking study with the JFP, we also had a similar bit in family medicine that we looked at, and we wanted to do some more fluorescent work with some drugs. Now, while it did work, it did start to become weaker when we were using the drugs with it too. So we started to see that the proteins and the drugs would move together around in the cell, which was really successful and great for us to find. So as I was saying to Scott before, my postdoc was 4 years, and that's because I was teaching at Gallaudet full-time as a professor there. My postdoc was honestly like a nights and weekends thing for me. It was a 4-year deal, so Gallaudet actually ended up providing me the opportunity after asking for federal money to open up a new deaf research-focused lab for me to then take a part of. Now, that was with Jennifer Nandez. She has worked at Gallaudet for a while now, but it was great because it allowed Gallaudet to go ahead with this agreement about 5 years ago or so now. But the problem was that they didn't really know how to spend it too well. They wanted to start as soon as they could, and they had about a $500,000 annual budget, which was huge for this center. And they started hiring staff and whatnot, and so then they started to apply for more money to try and recruit other people. And it was a great opportunity because this was a great new center that was opening up. Now, as I talked to a couple people yesterday about one person, a friend of mine named Peter in Oregon. I had offered this opportunity to him. And based on all the money that we had gotten, we thought that we would be able to have about $20 million worth of stuff that we would end up putting into this center, and Peter was interested in having me join it. So there was a staff position that was opening and at his new center, and so I went ahead and applied, and I was actually hired. And at the same time, there was a protest that happened shortly thereafter. What happened was the new president that was just assigned was then impeached at that university, and then things crashed. So there were 3 or 4 staff positions that were opened that never ended up actually hiring anyone because of this crash. And then from a several $million budget, we went down to 60,000 and then further down to 20,000 after the crash. And so there's still, arguments over who should have gotten what or why people were just kind of shoved off, but there was a lot of focus more on the undergraduate students and trying to keep them around. They couldn't actually bring in everyone that they wanted to after all because of those complications. So things didn't work out too well for those people over in Oregon for this new center. Right now, if I look back, I definitely am glad that that opportunity didn't work out because it allowed me to go to NIH and work there. So the lab that was eventually built, that I worked in, was focusing on how to incorporate deaf space, or architecture that focuses on the deaf perspective. So you can see here, like in this picture, there's a wider space between tables, which allows 2 people to have a conversation with sign language, which is great. And I can show you a couple more pictures, but you kind of get the feel for the architecture and the design. It's more open, it allows a lot more natural light in, and it just provides more access for visual communication, which is great. The lighting is specifically done to make sure that your brain doesn't get too exhausted from having to stare in it all day. This is a picture of one of my former students. It's just a silly picture that I took of her while she was in the lab. But she's doing some gene-related experiments. Now, while our lab that I was working in was being established and we were going through all of those cuts on our own end, we wanted to try and keep our focus on deaf-related research. So what we decided to do was have a second lab built under Carolyn Solomon. Now, she works a lot in micro and marine biology. So we wanted to try and figure out how we could have our 2 labs have some overlap. She works more in the quality of water in the DC area and looks more into estuaries and those things. And so there is one local river. DC has 2 that you're probably familiar with. The Potomac, and then there's a smaller river, the Niantic. And it's, kind of in the Delmarva area, and they kind of surround the DC island. But those 2 rivers surround it, and what we did was actually take some samples of the water over the course of a year and looked at different testing. So this is actually the pail that we ended up using to gather those samples. And that was over one summer that we worked on this project. Over 6 years, I have provided a lot of internship opportunities. Since the labs have been built and renovated, since the economy's picked back up, we have been able to do a lot more work, which has been really nice. So you might recognize some faces in the mix. But it's a great experience. We have a lot of fun. And the science part of it, of course, is very interesting. You know, we teach them about different ways for running different experiments, which is usually different from what they're used to. Graduate students usually have to write their own papers, and then they pass it off to me to edit, and we go back and forth. However, postdocs have to even take that a step further and work amongst themselves before they can bring things back to me as the mentor. So once graduated, and I kind of get the paper, it's confusing because I have to piece things together if I haven't really been in touch. And of course, there's so much going on as a chair for me and teaching and whatnot that I think the summer is the best time for me to try and catch up on all those spotty papers that I might have gotten from post-bac students that really don't have the hang of things yet. Whereas during the year, it's a lot easier to work with my postdocs. So that's a little bit about who I am and how I got here today. And now we'll shift gears and look more at the science mentoring research.
I don't know if you are already familiar with Dr. Hauser's work on the mentoring model. Are you familiar with the mentoring model that Dr. Hauser has developed? So it's capital-based. The capital theory is, wow, how do I explain the capital theory? Really, it's considered skills or knowledge that you can then invest into other people. Capital is money, yes, but thinking if networking is worth money if you put it in that way, or research is worth money, of course. You have to think about capital in different ways, not just money related. You have academic knowledge, number one. That's broad. It's as you're going through life at a university and you're taking your classes and you're learning different skills and you're learning how to navigate the academic world and college, and whether you want a PhD or you want to go for an MD, or what type of knowledge that you want or need for the specific discipline that you're going to pursue. As a teacher, we have to figure out how to instill those things into the students as well and increase their academic knowledge. We then have social capital, and it's very important for us to introduce each other to friends and colleagues and develop that type of environment and support system. We can all be more productive if we all have better social capital. That relates to also, how you present and how you behave and all those things that we need to learn. That's traditional capitals on the left side, the traditional capital theory. But here on the right, we have some new ideas about cultural wealth. It comes from Yosso and their article that they wrote regarding this, the sociology of science. There's no one way for anything. You might see someone present one bit of research, but a lot of research and background knowledge has gone into that one specific topic. So it's a lot more broad than what you might actually see. So the cultural wealth idea is based on a lot of research. Minority communities have their own ways of taking advantage of this as well. Navigational capital is one. As a minority, learning how I can get through TSA at the airport. Suppose I have a hearing aid and someone might try and get my attention and they think I'm ignoring them because I can't hear them, and then they realize. There are lots of stories of police shootings for minorities and deaf individuals as well. And that has to do with navigational capital also. So aspirational capital is related to role models. If I can see another successful deaf person, I can believe that I can do it as well. Number 6 is familial capital. There's a lot of discussion about, in the deaf community about that. A community can become your family and friends. You know, you don't have a script for life. And so when you're trying to figure out what you're going to do, even generally in the community, going to school, getting a college education, getting married, having children, that's called cultural life script. And that's different from each cultural community. The deaf community has a different life script as well. It includes giving back to the community, to the deaf community. Maybe attending alumni events from the schools that you attended. Those types of things are how you continue that. Number 7 is resistant capital. Maybe a sense of social injustice, or if you're not in the majority, you feel like the majority is resistant to you and to you breaking into that, and that you might be wrong by trying to do what you're doing in life. Last is linguistic capital. That can be taken advantage of sometimes. Suppose I speak Spanish and I go to a doctor who does not speak Spanish, then I maybe can be taken advantage of in some way. Or we could figure out ways to research how we could better help the language communication to improve and increase. Now, in science, is science easier in ASL or in English? That's another discussion that we have. But this is more from Peter Hauser's mentoring model. So for our study, you can see here how we went about it. To measure mentoring effectiveness, we looked at old surveys. We had 3 surveys, and they had different applications. But the questions, the items were all the same on each survey.
They didn't focus much on social capital.
They focused more on academic and discipline capital as opposed to social capital. But we did continue to add items to the surveys, and then we disseminated the survey and got our results and realized that there were many problems with the first draft. Traditional capital was very collinear.
A lot of our results were on the 0.98, 0.99, 0.92 side of things, and most people weren't really able to give us what we needed. That survey was so huge and dense. We didn't really think that those kinds of traditional capitals would be have such an impact or be the factor that kind of messed things up as much as it did. Now, at the bottom, we were able to see a difference with the cultural capitals, which were really different. The cultural wealth had a different impact on the people that took our survey. Another problem that we found out upon reflection on the survey was the option NA, or non-applicable. We saw that it had a larger impact on people who didn't feel like necessarily answering the question and would kind of default to the NA, and they ended up skipping a whole bunch of our survey items, which was kind of difficult. So when we fed that into SPSS, our factor analysis crashed. It could not handle it because the N was too small. With a bigger N, it could have, tolerated some of those skips, but unfortunately, not enough people ended up taking the survey, and of that small enough pool, enough of them were actually picking NA. So it ended up messing up a bit of what we were trying to go towards and caused a few of our data problems when we were attempting to do these analyses. So we decided to go ahead and do it a second time, and more of an interview-based approach. It was focus groups of 8. And what we did was try and look at any of those missing items that did not really quite come into play on the original survey. And what we ended up noticing was some really interesting themes. We had this water cooler talk effect come up a lot, because what ended up happening was in these focus groups, people made note of the fact that they felt oftentimes in a workplace that their hearing peers and colleagues were able to have conversations that essentially put up an invisible wall for the deaf person in the room. Now, think about your own experience as a deaf person in school. I felt a lot of the time that people were playing pranks on me, and I would be told that, oh, there's a party at our advisor's house or something, and I would go because I didn't know any better, but I kept getting pranked because I was deaf. And, teasing is one thing, but it was difficult to try and find these things, and these invisible walls that are put up, but the only time that you're actually let through them are to be tricked or teased, really is difficult. So these kinds of themes came up for a lot of us within these focus groups, and it was really interesting to see these kinds of conversations because they were almost cyclical. Our experiences were rather similar. I was thinking about those people that were in my life as I went through my own education, and realized that the people that were in the focus groups were having similar experiences. But all those that were in my life prior, like my advisors and those in my postdoc, didn't have the same experience that I did because they were mostly hearing people. So what we decided to do from here was look and ask students with a variable field what kinds of information, and they didn't have to give a name, we could use an alias, but we really wanted to try and document these experiences because it was so critical for us in this realization in these interviews and groups that we actually had all these similarities that were relevant and genuine. So what we did was work with Dr. Hauser and got his approval to eventually move forward with these ideas and hope to eventually express these as concerns, or at least try and form some kind of bond across a deaf community that felt so isolated or segregated for so long. So our clean factor analysis was great. It felt like a dream. I remember running it and just being thrilled to see things work out. I would, beat into the data set to hope for the same answer, and we kept getting it, luckily. And these were the 4 main factors that came out of my work. These themes were, of course, what I expected. I mean, it was one of those, oh, well, yeah, that's what we thought things. And yeah, don't get me wrong, there were some surprises, but it was pretty much what we expected to see, luckily enough. And we can use this graphic that I have here to compare some of my different variables. This question was really important to me. You can see here that this was some of the information from our survey, and we based it on one being either deaf themselves, or being in the quote deaf no, or the third option being in the quote deaf unaware or somewhat ignorant category. So here are some more results. You might notice 2 small surprises. So social capital we thought would be a separate factor. There were some mentors and advisors that did not seem to really have the skill set that we needed. But as far as our survey is concerned, we could not identify everything within the traditional capitals, and we realized that we did actually have to parse it out a little bit differently. Now, the other surprise that you might notice here, which personally, I kind of thought that the aspirational capitals would be more important than they turned out being.
For this Bridges presentation, I discussed my research, but also wanted to leave you with some take-home messages as well. Really, I grew up with the American philosophy that you work as hard as you can and you'll get everything you want, and that's really not true. There are some exceptions, yes, but not all of us can do that. Not all of us can be rich. There are some advantages, of course, but you have to take advantage of opportunities as well. One example of an opportunity that came up for me was for a postdoc experience. And I could have gone with what I was studying, but I took advantage of a different opportunity, something that was not along the lines of what I was doing. I was out of the box, it was out of my field. It was a different type of statistics, and it wasn't quite comfortable, but it was worth it. It was a good experience. I'm thinking about how I got my Gallaudet position. It was through connections. How I got my postdoc experiences through connections, through previous mentors. When I went to University of Maryland as well, it was most all of my work has been through connections, and now I'm here for this presentation through my connections as well. Choose to work with people who want to work with you. I maybe had made a mistake going to the University of Maryland and they didn't actually want to work with me so much. Well, my postdoc advisor wanted me, and it was clear. And he was willing to meet me halfway, and we had dual respect for each other. It wasn't the same way with Maryland, and I think it's very important that you choose. If there's a good medical school that you're looking at going to, but they don't want deaf students there, that's not the best place for you, possibly. So, I also changed this to apply a different way. Your friends, same with your friends. It's not worth back and forth trying to keep friends. Be with those who want to be with you. I did a lot of interviews, and it's best to have a lot more experience with publications and research experience. And yes, it's good to learn how to work in the lab, but you learn a lot more by doing a postdoc experience. None of those pictures involved work. I teach my students it's very important for them to have a personal life as well. I have been talking with some people that I advise students to go to PhD programs and to go where they'll have support. Deaf individuals must have a support system. It will be very, very difficult to get through a PhD program without support, without a lot of support. And I think many of you understand that it will help you to get through. And that's it. Thank you.